All right, it's a little bit weird for the last time here, but good evening, everybody. Welcome to the last general meeting of UMet Energy Club for the 2020-2021 academic year. It's weird that I haven't met most of you in person, but it's been great, and I hope you've enjoyed what we've done so far. If you haven't already signed in, go ahead and sign at the link there. And so everyone knows we are recording, so if you feel comfortable turning on your cameras, that'd be awesome. But if you want to use a virtual background or if you want to leave your video off, that also totally works. Feel free to chat me at any point if you have questions or concerns, or you can also send us an email. And ordinarily, I would have liked to do this at every single one of our meetings, but because we only have an hour, I decided to leave it until now. But throughout the year, those of us who've gathered from Minnesota Makoche have gathered on the lands of Dakota, Lakota, and Ojibwe people. And so I hope that this year you've learned some things about Indigenous justice and history, and that you'll kind of take this work with you and read a lot of the things we talked about. You know, we read Braiding Sweetgrass in the book club this year, which was wonderful. I think we all really enjoyed it. Thanks, Dan, for representing. But yeah, I think it's sort of part of an ongoing mission, I think, now of Energy Club, and I hope that each of you, that it's resonated with each of you, and that you'll all take it away and learn some more with it. So a couple of final announcements for the year. You can see some pictures of us. I think this was just last weekend at Big Woods Heritage Forest. We had a lot of fun planting some baby red oak saplings. It was wonderful. So we have a couple more. They're both in mid-May, which I realize some of you who are from out of state might be moving out by that time. I will be moving out literally the day after after this last one, so I'm sticking around for that long. But if you have time and you're interested, it would be wonderful. We still have a couple spots open for each of these, so you can go ahead and visit the spreadsheet here, and then there are also registration links for the Great River Greening events on that spreadsheet. If you haven't already filled out the form, if you're interested in being a board member, please try to do that soon. We will start reaching out to people in just a little bit. We're going to wait till the finals are over and stuff, so don't worry about that. But if you're interested, feel free to fill that out, and we'll get in touch pretty soon. And so I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Dan Philippon studies American environmental literature and its relationship to the ideas of nature, culture, and place. He seeks to understand the rhetorical strategies and practical effects of literary texts and their creators, particularly with regard to the historical roots of our contemporary environmental values. His scholarship is grounded most firmly in the area of literary criticism known as eco-criticism, but it is also strongly influenced by current work in environmental history, environmental ethics, and conservation biology. He served as a past president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, or ASLE, as a senior fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Germany. You might recognize the name Rachel Carson, hopefully. And as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Turin and University of Gastronomic Sciences in Italy, and as a visiting professor at the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon in France. So thank you, Professor Philippon, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you to start our discussion today.
Great, thanks, BJ. And thanks everybody for being here. End of the term, finally a little sun out there. Nevertheless, you are here and I'm impressed. I also want to just acknowledge what an incredibly well-organized group you are. When I was involved in student groups, they were never this organized. So you should be glad to have had such good leadership in BJ and your other officers. So props to all of you. Seems like you've done a lot of work this academic year, and also I hope have had a lot of fun despite our very bizarre pandemic context. So let me share my screen with you. And say just a few words by way of opening. And let me double check a few things. First, everybody can hear me okay? And you should be able to see an opening slide that says sustainability in the Anthropocene. Okay, very good. So in order for me to present this as best I can, I'm going to minimize my window other than my slides. So if you, if anything goes awry, I would appreciate it if you would speak up before our discussion occurs. I think that's the best way to do it. So as Vijay said, I'm in the English department here virtually at the University of Minnesota. And I've been here since 1998. So that's some 23 years. And the world has changed a lot while I've been here, and that has been all mostly for the good, I guess I would say. So the other thing you should know is that I team teach a class with the director of the Institute on the Environment, whose name is Jessica Hellman, and we've had the privilege of having Vijay in that class, and that's how part of the reason I think that I'm here today is to allow some of the questions that we raised in that, have been raising in that class, to enter into the conversation with you all in the Energy Club. So with that said, Vijay asked me to talk for 20 minutes or so, something like that. And that would leave time for about 30 minutes of conversation with basically one question, I think, that would drive that conversation and is also behind my initial comments, just to give us a frame for things. And that is, what does it mean to live a good life in the Anthropocene? That's a big question, I know. But I think that's why we're all here at the university, is to ask big questions. And I know you've been asking a lot of them through your book club this term, and been thinking big thoughts about the place of energy and sustainability given our current moment. So anyway, that's the plan. And I thought I would start with two things. The first is this comic, which I like a lot, and which illustrates the evolving complexity of our understanding of environment and sustainability. Back in the 80s there, right, you could just pick up your litter and save the earth. In the 90s, well, maybe you need to recycle and you can save the earth. In the 2000s, well, it gets a little harder. You need to reduce your carbon footprint and then you can save the earth. But now, here in the new millennium, all we need to do, really, it's that easy, is completely restructure global economic systems. And, you know, you might be able to save a remnant of humanity. And I love that this is like a dad telling the parent son that these are the, you know, this is the future for you. But it's this, on the one hand, then we have this really big systemic change. This is this kind of stuff that we have to address, that should be part of our understanding of the good life. But then on the other hand, this nice quote that I saw, this may have been on Twitter or some version thereof, from a student who said, today, my anthropology professor said something kind of really beautiful. You all have a little bit of I want to save the world in you. That's why you're here in college. I want you to know that it's okay if you only save one person, and it's okay if that person is you. And the person follows up and says, I feel like a few people I know could stand to read this. And what I like a lot about this is it recognizes that this impetus, this desire to save the world, is present in all of us, I hope, as students, in one way or another. But that we also have to realize that we not only can we not do it alone, but that it's such a big task that we need to think carefully about our role and the kind of self-reflection that it involves, and that recognizing that even that is a big task, right? So we have on the one hand this huge structural change that has to happen, and on the other hand, a lot of internal meditation and reflection that is also really meaningful. And so that's sort of the tension that I want to get at today, and maybe throw in a little science too. So in order to do that, I thought I would focus on the concept of the Anthropocene, which actually is part of a set of three terms that I'll be talking about and that are likely familiar to all of you. Again, I'm just really trying to set our discussion in place. And that is the Anthropocene, which came about in the year 2000. The idea of the Great Acceleration, which appeared around 2007 in an article also on the Anthropocene. And then the notion of planetary boundaries, which was coined right around the year 2009. All, there's sort of a a set of people who've been involved in making these terms more publicly accessible and publicly aware. So again, some of this will likely be review. I won't spend too much time on it, but it'll get us to the place we need to be, I think. So the first one, the great acceleration, is illustrated by these graphs, which you've probably seen versions of if you haven't seen versions of this slide. There are a host of socioeconomic trends that we've seen since the year 1950. In each of these little slides, you can see there's a little red spot, and that's the year 1950, and that's when a lot of things change, right? That's when we see the number of large dams go up, and urban population go up, and fertilizer consumption go up, and so on. And we see the same thing in terms of Earth system trends, levels of nitrous oxide and shrimp aquaculture and ocean acidification and so on. So we see an enormous acceleration since 1950 of both of these kinds of trends, which is now known as the Great Acceleration. We also know that there are some boundaries or limits, to use a slightly older language, to what our biosphere can support. And we've seen, this was in 2009 when this concept first came out, that we have crossed what Johan Rockström and several of his colleagues feel like are the planetary boundaries for biodiversity loss, for the nitrogen cycle. We're coming up on the boundaries. We were coming up on the boundaries in 2009 on the climate crisis, and there was reasonable consensus that, and then if we don't get it together, certainly in the next 20 years, possibly less, those also we will have crossed those boundaries of the safe planetary boundaries. So all of those things are kind of framed by this idea of the Anthropocene, that we're in a moment that is very distinctive. And so you can see there have been many magazine covers regarding this idea, the most famous of which is up at the top there in The Economist, that says, "Welcome to the Anthropocene, Geology's New Age." But this is a term that's really captured so many people's attention these days. And I want to talk just a little bit of where it came from, and then some of the criticisms that have been offered of it. So this is a term that appeared first in 2000. It was in an article co-authored by Eugene Stormer, who's a limnologist, and Paul Crutzen, the Nobel-winning atmospheric chemist. What I love about its emergence was that it appeared in the Global Change newsletter on page 17. And so they didn't think this was important enough to put on the first page of the newsletter, right? They figured, well, yeah, we'll stick it there at the end, and maybe somebody will come across this idea. Of course, this idea now that has essentially changed the world. And Eugene Stormer had kind of used it in his teaching. Independently, Paul Crutzen had been at a conference and suggested it as a term that could mark this new age. The two of them learned about one another's usage and then co-authored this article. But it actually wasn't until 2002 that Paul Crutzen really publicized this in a one-page article in the journal Nature. So if this is either new for you or you don't know this history, let me suggest that you consult this one-page article, because it's a really nice summary of what Crutzen was doing in 2002 and where his thinking was, that is. So there's a number of reviews of this. One you can find in the Annual Review of Environment and Resources by Yadvinder Malhi, and it shows how since that 2002 article in the journal Nature, usage of this term in scientific journals has just skyrocketed. This article in 2007 is where we first learn about the Great Acceleration, and then the establishment of the Anthropocene Working Group, which I'll talk about in a second. That front cover, The Economist, appears, and then scientific journals start to be founded around this idea. So the Anthropocene Working Group that chart mentioned is a subcommittee of a commission. This is the way scientific organizations work. The International Commission on Stratigraphy has a subcommission on quaternary stratigraphy, and they have an Anthropocene Working Group. You can learn much more about this in what is a really nice publication called The Anthropocene as a Geological Time Unit, a guide to the scientific evidence in current debate. And that's available online. Everybody can access it. Well, this group took a vote. They took a vote in May of 2019, the Anthropocene Working Group, and they said two things that are important here. One thing they said is that this idea should be treated as a formal chronostratigraphic unit defined by what's called a GSSP, or a global boundary strata type section and point, otherwise what people call a golden spike. And 97% of the working group said that yes, the Anthropocene should be treated in this way, right? We should have something that we call this new age. And the second thing they said was that the primary guide for the base of this should be one of the stratigraphic signals around the mid-20th century. Here, 88% of that working group said yes. So this is now going to continue through the various commissions and subcommissions and so on as they try to gather more information about this as a geological concept. So they've put together a list of some markers of the Anthropocene, most of which will be familiar to all of you. They talk about the fact that there's been this huge increase in erosion, for instance, and in sediment transport from agriculture. They talk about the increased anthropogenic changes to cycles like the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. They point to the changes that are caused by those perturbations, like climate change and ocean acidification and dead zones. They talk about rapid changes in the biosphere and loss of biodiversity. And of course, things like the production of plastics and of various kind of other industrial products like fly ash and so on. And they're saying, this is a new age. Why is it a new age? And how can it be found in the geological record? Well, here are some of the reasons. But they're looking for what they call a golden spike. And there's an example. This is actually a real thing, right? It's like this marker you put in a geological layer. And here's one in Australia for one of the historical sections. So they're looking for what they call a distinct stratigraphical signature. If you look geologically, is there a point where we can say we are in a new age? And the working group says the sharpest and most globally synchronous that may form a primary marker is made by the artificial radionuclides spread worldwide by the thermonuclear bomb tests from the early 1950s. So they say, if we look at there, we can start to see in the geological record that this is a new geological age. And how interesting that it also does, that 1950s date again, right? Connects to what we see with the Great Acceleration. So what really is crucial is recognizing that this is a concept that comes out of science for all of the good reasons that should come out of science. And there are many, many possible places where we have thought maybe the Anthropocene could start, but they focused on right here in 1950s, right, with what happens here in the Great Acceleration. And the question is, will we then cross those planetary boundaries? Can we make it into a good Anthropocene? And what would that look like? What would it mean to live a good life there? Better to have a safe Anthropocene. We don't want to go up here, of course, with Anthropocene rupture. So I think that, as a concept, it's a really useful concept to have around, and it helps kind of to frame our moment in really important ways. And it's basically, here we are at the top of this geological heap, according to one cartoonist. And they're suggesting the Holocene is now over, and we're now in this very new age. However, not everybody thinks this is such a great idea, as you may know. There have been a lot of critiques of this concept. And so I want to lay out 5 of them and then give you just an example of 1 or 2, and then we can chat. And I spent enough time on the Anthropocene because I think it's important for you to understand really the kind of full foundations of this idea and where it came from, and understand that it's not just it started out as an idea that somebody just tossed off. Paul Crutzen just tossed it off in this conference, but it's now got a very robust kind of industry related to understanding it. But nevertheless, a lot of people say, well, I'm not so sure about this. And they're not so sure about it for these 5 reasons. This is my best guess at what they are. 1, people say, this really encourages an approach to in what we could understand as environmental problems that's globalist, right? Like the UN is going to solve these things. That's technocratic, that they might be solved by the introduction of technologies and only technologies. That's materialistic, that says, well, maybe we can buy our way out of this problem. And that's managerial, right? That again says like, we're going to get some experts in here to tinker and they're going to fix things. So that's one critique. Another one is that this idea of the Anthropocene universalizes this term humanity, right? So it says, well, humans are the problem. And it doesn't recognize the fact that, well, that's a pretty big category. And there's a lot of differences in there that actually really matter. And that's quite important. The third critique is that it reinforces a view of the world that's focused on us, right? This is the Anthropocene. This is the new human age. Well, it's the age of a lot of other things too, right? There are pill bugs out there that no one has given the memo that this is the Anthropocene. So it really gives us a view of the world in which our fate and our action or our inaction is what we should focus on. That's our primary idea. And it doesn't make this move that I think could be quite useful to say, well, what if we looked at the world from other perspectives? What about the rest of the living biosphere? Doesn't that matter too? The fourth, and this may be something we can talk some more about, is that it's really merely a descriptive term. We say this is this age. It doesn't really give us much to say like, well, what should it be? What should it look like? In other words, it doesn't give us any tools for imagining an alternative future. And if we need anything these days, it's tools for imagining an alternative future. The fifth thing, which I really want to give you a few examples about, is that this concept is grounded in a linear temporal framework, right? You saw that cartoon of the geological stages. So it's going forward in one way. That is not the case that every culture agrees with that framework. It also is grounded in a concern about future catastrophe, that catastrophe happened somewhere in the future, will happen somewhere in the future. While, of course, for many cultures and societies, this has been an ongoing catastrophe here in North America, for instance, for the last 400 years. And it's also it's grounded in a set of scientific practices, which some say are actually unknowingly, for the most part, I think people would argue, both racist and colonial. So I want to talk about what's built into that last critique since you've been reading Kimmer. And again, this is just to seed some conversation. So I'll point to this book. It's available free online from the University of Minnesota Press because you're at our amazing institution here. It was published not too long ago. I think it's 2019. And it's called The Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. It's not a long publication. It's available digitally. But I think it raises this question, well, when we're talking about the Anthropocene, whose Anthropocene are we talking about? So to briefly give you Yusuf's argument, Yusuf says, I seek to undermine the givenness of geology as an innocent or natural description of the world, to see its modes of inscription and circulation as a doubling of the notion of property, and which I'll get to in a second. But just keep in mind here, I think there's enormous value in the scientific enterprise, and that's why I spent enough time on it at first, to get us to understand why this is so important to geologists and how deeply well thought out this concept is. But at the same time, Yusuf says, science is not value free. And even a science that seems like it might be, like, hey, we're just studying rocks here, Yusuf says, no, actually, this is tied into a whole set of cultural values and perspectives and perceptions. So I'll point you to this blog called Inhabiting the Anthropocene, in which a geologist herself named Lynn Sorghum was introduced to Yusuf's book, started to read it and was like, I don't, wait, this is critiquing my whole field. I don't get it. And she talked to her daughter. So she has a wonderful blog post about this. And then she starts to say like, oh, I think I get it now. Like, I think I understand. This looks really different if you're from an oppressed population, right? This looks really different as an idea if you're not part of the scientific establishment. And so she summarizes here, for instance, Yusof examines how the grammar of geology is foundational to establishing the extractive economies of subjective life and the earth under colonialism and slavery. So there's more than we can talk about in this short time, but I encourage you to check it out. She's basically saying, like, we can't have the process of colonialism without some perspectives of science, without some ideas that the world is there for us to modify and change, and that it enables the economies that follow from that. So it's a fascinating critique of what seems like a relatively objective concept, like, oh, the Anthropocene. And you can also point to other people in the humanities, like Donna Haraway, who's written eloquently and somewhat cryptically, that's how she writes, for good or for ill, for some people, about other scenes that are out there. Well, maybe it's the age of capital, the capitalocene, or maybe it's the plantationocene, that is the transformation of much of our world into plantations for an extractive economy. Or what she calls the Cthulhu-cene, the idea that there's a sort of tentacles stretching everywhere now around our world that encompass all different kinds of versions of other ages that the Anthropocene concept has brought out, particularly in the humanities. So all of that is to say that, of course, all these things can be captured in an office space meme, and it boils down to, yeah, if people could stop destroying the only planet that supports human life, that would be great. So if you have yet to see Office Space, I certainly encourage you to. It's a classic among classics. And that sort of now just raises the question, what should we do? And I'm nearing the end, of course, as I hope you can see. And in our class that VJ is part of, what we offer is what we think we could call a taxonomy of responses. That is, there's many different things we could do. We could continue with business as usual in the capitalism. We can try to be happy and consume less and find alternatives to capitalism. Maybe we can engineer our way out of the Anthropocene through technology. We might try ecological restoration and acknowledgement of the wildness in our world. We could focus on social and environmental justice and try to resist a lot of these changes. Or we could turn to romanticism in various utopian communities and kind of retreat from the world. So there's a lot of options out there as we think about what the good life might be and mean. Here are two quick examples of two of these. When we talk about restructuring global capitalism, or like was offered in that cartoon I began with, this is Roy Scranton, who writes a lot about the Anthropocene, and he says in this quotation here from the New York Times, you know, he points to World War II and he says, mobilization during World War II was a national mobilization against foreign enemies, while what's required today is a global mobilization against an international economic system, carbon-fueled capitalism. And he says, you know, to mobilize during World War II, like that was huge. That took a ton of work. And what kind of work over how many years would it take to unify and mobilize the entire industrialized world against itself? Which raises the question, sort of, do we have the time to remake capitalism when we only have 20 years or so? And some would say no, like we've got to do this within capitalism in order to solve it. Another approach, of course, is aim small. And this comes from, is an idea that comes from Eric Demore, who's a writer in Toronto, Canada, and he advocates for what he calls a palliative approach, just like you would take at the end of someone's life, where you're not trying to cure cancer because you can't anymore. All you're trying to do is relieve pain. And so he says, this approach is one which aims small, which focuses on comforting his immediate world, his school, his street, the ravine behind his house. The palliative environmentalist, concerned with the planet's health, but honest about its prognosis, performs acts which focus on the short term, the local, the concrete, on protecting one species of bird or omitting red meat from her diet. So that gets us to our questions. I'll leave these up for a second and then I'll stop sharing. These are questions that I think we could talk about, but we can talk about anything you'd like to talk about. One is this concept a good one, a useful one, or does it do more harm than good? Second, if whatever that we call this moment, how should we respond to it? And third, if part of those responses is also trying to live a good life of some kind as an individual, what does that mean? Because this is a really complicated moment. So those are some thoughts and some ideas maybe to get us talking and to just kind of frame things. Hopefully that was useful. Like I said, I couldn't follow the chat at the same time as I was presenting, but I'll take a quick look at it here. Oh, great. Thank you, Vijay, for posting those questions. So let's open things up and just, any reactions whatsoever that you might have, or maybe these are obviously very familiar concepts to some of you, maybe less so to others. The critiques may be familiar, less so to others. I don't know. And I also, of course, it's hard with a class. I would know where we've been. You've all been talking about a lot of this stuff, and I haven't been around here to hear it. So forgive me if I've duplicated anything you've already discussed.
So I kind of had a thought while you were going through this, and it connects to one of the classes that I'm in currently, which is English 3506, Social Movements and Community Education with Eric Daig. And one of the things we've been talking about is, engaging in activism and being an active part of your community, but only up to your means and your resources and like what you can expend at a certain time. And I definitely think that applies here, especially with the set of the 6 or 8 like potential responses that you were showing us. And it's different people can have different responses. And especially when you have, some people going on the more, outspoken political side and trying to fight for the legislature, and some people just working with making community gardens and installing solar panels on their house. And it's sort of understanding that everyone's going to work, up to their own means. And it's not, reasonable to expect everyone to sort of act as this monolith. Like you talked about, humanity is incredibly diverse. And so I guess just, understanding and respecting that people are going to do what they can when they can, because we all do care about this planet.
That's a wonderful comment. And I'm glad you connected with Eric Daig. He's just a terrific individual who also happens to be a teacher. And we're really fortunate to have Eric as a member of the department. Just also a very kind soul, a very generous person. And so, Valerie, I love what you said. Actually, I think that point is crucial. And I obviously artificially sort of set up this dichotomy between an individual response and this collective change that we need. And what I like about your comment is that it complicates that, as it should be. That's a dichotomy that should be complicated, and it recognizes this diversity, right? And the diversity of our abilities, of our means, and the way that those change over time too, right? They're not all the same. My abilities and means and effort and possibilities for me are different now than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, etc. And that's really useful. There is not one path, right? If there's an answer to all of this, there is no one path for each of us. And that can apply in so many different contexts, but it certainly applies here very, very heavily. And that path changes over time too. So that's a wonderful way to start us off. Thank you. We can either take, pursue some of these questions if they're of interest to you, or if you just have general reflections on them about, the role of science and all of this. Some people are really, really unhappy with the idea of the Anthropocene as a concept, and really are very aggressively see this as a really problematic concept, and thus science as a really problematic endeavor to have proposed it. And so I don't know if that critique resonates with any of you. I know many of you are in science or engineering related fields. I think not all of you. But does that, critique kind of sit well with you or not well? Or do you think that there's a place for this term? Is it a useful term to frame our moment? Or should we really be talking about it in a different way?
I'll share something from the expo a couple weeks back, because not everyone
great.
Make it. But Dr. Wazia Tomi, she's a decolonization activist. She's Wakwe Tuan Dakota from the Yellow Medicine Village. And someone had asked a question during the panel where they were like, is there a good, like, how do we incorporate indigenous values or ways of knowing into Western science? And she pushed back really hard against that answer because to her, it was like not about incorporation, because incorporating means appropriating, was sort of her conclusion from that question. And so her response was like, it's not the answer for Dan, the reason that you cited, that it's rooted in colonialism, and the whether, you know, we as individuals, right, where it's like I may personally be pursuing it in a way just out of curiosity, but that's not where the field necessarily came from. And so the language that we use and the way the science is approached as a field isn't necessarily the right way. And so her answer was that indigenous science is the answer and Western science is the supplement. That's how it should be. And so it's curious to think that like here we are, right, thinking all these things, and we have the capacity to use words and language in this way to communicate these ideas, where we may think, you know, the animal world can't do that, but we just can't hear their conversations. But to like that criticism of like putting us at the top of the pyramid, right, I think is the main reason why I feel like I push back against it a little bit. Is I'm on the baby steps version of Dr. Wazia Deween's argument. I'm not all the way where she is, but I wanted to share that idea with all of you because that's just something that I heard that I thought might catch the conversation.
I think that's a great addition to the conversation. I mean, and it's also something that we can apply here. I'm not unself-conscious of the fact that even the way I framed my comments is one way to frame an approach to this, right? If I were Robin Wall Kimmerer or someone else, I would come in and I'd probably start with a story. My story might be my whole presentation. And my story might also be really personal, right? I might tell you instead, not about, here I'm going to categorize these things and give you the history. Instead, it's going to be like, I want to tell you about my family, and I want to explain how we got here and how where I came from and what we should be doing. And I might never get around to talking about the Anthropocene. And that's a totally different way of doing this. And I really want to validate that approach and have us acknowledge that, I mean, I'm in English, right? Storytelling matters. And I think it's really important to see that is absolutely, as Vijay's talking about, you know, it might be that this more westernized, bulletized version that we're so familiar with in PowerPointing should be supplementary to our stories that we tell one another. In any case, yes, I think that that's really really valid and important challenge to us, and to think not only about what kind of science should be supplementary, but maybe what kind of approach and attitude. Sometimes I do feel like we kind of have to move quickly to get stuff done, right? And this is one case where I was like, okay, I really want to give you the 20-minute version of how to understand this. And this is the way that it works best for me. And I've learned, at least from my teaching, works best for many people. But I also recognize there are other ways to do this, right? And that's also really important. And that you all know that what's likely obvious, that I'm a white middle-aged guy. And so, like, surprise. I should have started, by the way, and mentioned I'm he, him pronouns, but I think Vijay, referred to me that way. So I've assumed that was clear. And that influences things as well, right? That's going to influence not only how I present, but the way I perceive things and what I don't perceive. And so all of us, I think that as we consider the Anthropocene as a concept and consider what it means to be a good life, to, again, build on this great comment that Valerie made at the beginning, that there are other ways of doing this. And the best thing that we can do is to remain as open as possible to those other things, and more than just remain open, to actively seek them out. And I know you've been doing that with your reading group, and I'm so impressed. I think that's so critically important. And this book, by the way, by Kimmerer, has just been, if I worked for Milkweed, I mean, I know people who work for Milkweed and they're like, this is awesome, right? I mean, this book just continues to find audiences all across the country, all around the world. I think I mentioned in class, because we read an excerpt of it in our Good Life class, that when the book first came out, a colleague of mine at Milkweed said, hey, Robin's got this new book out. I'd seen her earlier, and knew her from a different context, and he said, "Hey, Robin's got this new book out. Do you want to, do an event here at the U?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that would be great." And people came. It was fun. We had a really great conversation. She brought some sweetgrass with her, and but it was, a relatively modest event. There were, I don't know, 30 to 50 people there, maybe something like that. If we did that today, it would be incredible, right? There'd be so many people. Why? Because what she has to say has been so significant in the way that she has had to say it has been so significant. So again, talking about storytelling, she's chosen an approach not to say, here are the 5 critical things you need to know about Indigenous wisdom. I know she's going to tell stories about her life, and it's a really important. It's important methodologically to understand what she's doing, as well as the messages that she's sending and the content and so on. So yeah. Other thoughts
Actually,
that you
Dan,
have?
fun fact, we actually wanted to invite Dr. Kimmerer to speak at the expo, and she
Yeah.
was so booked out we couldn't. So that gives you a sense of word has spread very quickly.
And I will, expect that it probably wouldn't have been cheap either. So not because of her, but because of demand pricing, right? And she can use that money that she earns to do the good work that she wants to do, and more power to her for that reason. So yeah, absolutely.
I was kind of curious if you could provide more insight into like the critiques of the Anthropocene, because I've talked about it like in some of my classes before, and I'm like, before today, I was kind of at the point where I was like, okay, like this, it makes sense as to like why they would categorize it, like scientifically speaking, but I personally didn't think it would be of much like actual use, because to me, it just seemed like a classification, not something that would like inspire any like meaningful change. So I was kind of like that book you had mentioned about, well, I forgot the title of it, but it was like about
billion
the
black
billion black,
Anthropocenes
yeah.
or none. Yeah.
I was kind of curious if you could provide maybe a little bit more like detail on some of the critiques that like were in that book, because that, like, the more that I think about it, the more I think like critique would make sense.
Well, I think the primary concern of a lot of people is that this is a term, and it's not sort of, though part of the critique in that book is about the science, right? And not actually about the science as practiced, but as it is, the effect that it has had, what it has enabled, and what that worldview in general has enabled. And so it's really a broader critique of kind of Western science, not dissimilar to what Vijay was just talking about. And so there's that piece of it. But I think that speaks to the larger way in which this concept has been taken up by the culture. And so I think that's why I wanted you to see that Economist cover as one example of the way a term that started out, as a kind of throwaway term at the scientific conference has blown up way beyond its scientific context, right? So you've got this group of, I think there's like 80 or 90 geologists in this Anthropocene working group who vote on all this stuff and take their geology really seriously, as they should, right? That's what they do. They're really good at it, and we're glad they're doing it. But this concept now has been taken up way beyond that, right? And just exploded and framed our response to this moment. And so I think it's enormously important. Well, some of us could say like, oh, well, like you mentioned, Nolan, that they're trying to describe something and it's relatively limited to this geological sphere. And in some ways that's true. You're absolutely right. But in other ways, it's taken off and been picked up by people in culture, in media, in all kinds of spheres. And it's brought along with it then all the things that are not possibly so great about that scientific context uncritically. And so if we just say, oh yes, since 1950, look what's happened, we can see all this great acceleration of all of these trends. We possibly crossed these planetary boundaries, and we're going to give this a name, the Anthropocene. That really neglects some of the other perspectives and other experiences that people have had of this moment. Now it becomes, again, about what's going to happen and about measuring trends. If we look at it, however, from the perspective, since we've been talking about it, of the Dakota or the Anishinaabe here in Minnesota, a lot of, and I'm not Dakota or Anishinaabe, so I can't speak for them. I can only report what I know. And that is that a lot of them would say, like, well, wait a second, like, this either doesn't apply to us, isn't our worldview. We don't see the world that way. We see that we've been living our life in a certain way, our ideas of the good life and our ideas of all our relations with other beings. And who are you to now suddenly redefine this, right? And in redefining it, you've also narrowed the possibilities for change. You've also narrowed the scope of what we can or should accomplish. And there might be other solutions and other ways of imagining a new future that aren't encapsulated by this term. So the Anthropocene maybe doesn't encapsulate the kind of indigenous wisdom or the teaching of plants that Robin Wall Kimmerer would be in favor of. So, when I first started thinking about this idea, I will confess, I was like, well, what's the big deal? Like, all these trends are happening. I see them. And I think that understanding them and laying them out in this way is really helpful. It helps people to say, like, holy shit, like, what's happening? But at the same time, the more you kind of push at this, you realize, well, wait a second, these critiques aren't like a bunch of pointy-headed academics just saying, like, I think there are some problems with this, right? There are actually some serious problems with this. And it's a way to recognize that terms, again, don't come without baggage. That there's always baggage with something, right? In good ways sometimes, but also in problematic ways. We carry a lot of things along with us, and things that seem like transparently fine. And this is why I offer, like, my own presentation as a kind of example of self-critique. It seems, hopefully, it seems like transparently fine. He's telling us about the Anthropocene, but it brings along some baggage too, right? Like, maybe I should have told you a story instead. And you would have walked away differently. You would have walked away moved, maybe emotionally changed. So nothing comes without baggage. And so those are the critiques, I think, that if that's helpful in some ways. Maybe I'll put it this way. If you go home for the break and talk to people who aren't at the U, aren't sort of part of a scientific community in some ways, and are just like, and they're like, hey, tell me about this talk you heard. What was the last talk you heard? And you're like, oh, it was about the Anthropocene. What do you think they would say? Would they be like, about the what? or would they be like, oh, tell me more? That sounds fascinating. Like, that's a real question to all of you, because I think it speaks to, does this term have significance and traction in the public realm? And if it doesn't have traction, that also tells us something, I think. So maybe we can get a few people to say, like, if you were to do that, what do you think the person you're talking to would say? Would they say, what is that? Or who cares? Or would they be, like, really interested?
I think if I were talking to my family, I would get a lot of, tell me more. Like, that sounds interesting, because my family is all engineers. But, like, I work at a gas station convenience store, and I have a feeling if I mentioned it there, I would get a lot of, okay, cool, whatever.
Typical engineering geek, right? Yeah, absolutely. And so,
okay, nerd.
That's right. So maybe this isn't a term for everybody, right? Or it's also a recognition there's no one path. Like, it can be really useful in certain contexts, but in other contexts, we need something else. And this term isn't going to do it. I don't know. Let me hear from a few other folks we haven't heard from. You have friends or family who might react positively, negatively, or meh to the Anthropocene term?
I mean, this is kind of just who I am, but I don't think I'd bring up the term at all. Like, it feels like such an academic, like, stuck up, like, look at me, I'm smart, I listen to stuff. And it's just like, it doesn't really feel like it actually apply to, like, a lot of people, I guess.
Ethan, I think that's awesome. And that's actually why, so the title of the course that Jessica and I currently teach has changed this year. It used to be Living the Good Life at the End of the World, Sustainability in the Anthropocene. And we changed it. We changed it in part because this year we felt like it's really not possible to live the good life in 2020, 21, like to live it, that is. So we changed it to Seeking the Good Life because we can still seek it, but this year has been really just a shit year. Let's just lay it out there, right? And so we felt like we really needed to focus on the seeking and what could happen, what we're going for. But we also changed its sustainability in the 21st century for the simple reason that we felt like if you're looking for a class that and you're confronted with a term you haven't understood yet, like the class is about explaining this term. So we can't well expect people to be like, oh, I want to take this class on this thing I know nothing about. So, but everybody knows what the 20th century is. We're all living in it. And we realize that that's really a synonym for the Anthropocene, right? This is the moment that we are in. It just happens to be also connected to this century. So we changed it, Ethan, for exactly the reasons you're talking about, because yeah, you might not even use that term yourself because people would just be like, no. So, I don't know if any of you, have thoughts on that other big question beyond what the very good and perhaps plenty enough comment that Valerie made initially, which is that there are, again, many paths to what the good life could be, but maybe a way into it is like, do you think that is that term even useful now? Are we all still seeking the good life, or are we really more focused on just trying to not immolate ourselves with climate change? I wonder about that. This is a term that's been around, of course, since Aristotle, since people started to think about not just what it means to live a moral life, but to live a fulfilling life, to live a life of meaning, of purpose. That term is meant to encapsulate those things. It's actually not meant to be like sucking on Coronas on the beach, nice though that is. And so, but maybe that's not what we can do right now or should be thinking about. And I'm curious if especially if some of you are at the end of your time here at the U, or are still in it, whether you think that that's a useful framework for us anymore or not.
Mention real quick is Dakota author Diane Wilson. I had a conversation with her last week, and she was saying, like, you're talking, learning about these things, and in the Dakota way, you demonstrate by example, by living a certain way, and then you kind of hope that other people will see and observe and act. And I asked her very pointedly, I was like, is that enough? I feel like in order for things to happen, like, we need to all be activists. So that was just a question that has come up for me. And now I'm like, well, now I'm going to a new state, after I guess my old state, I'm going back to Illinois. But after this, I'm going to meet a whole new community of people. So it's like, how am I going to continue what I'm doing here in a place where I don't really know anybody? So that was just an idea, a thing I've been confronted.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it is contextual, of course, right? What it means to live a good life. And if you're going to live a good life as part of a community, you have to know that community. You've got to get to know that community. You've got to listen. You've got to listen a lot first before you dip your toe in and so on.
I guess I have a comment.
Yeah.
When you were talking about that guy, I forgot his name, but kind of how he was like more accepting the disease or whatever and doing what you can.
The palliative environmentalist. Yeah.
A little part of me was like, I guess like cringed a little bit because I'm like, no, I don't want to accept that our like world is dying. Like, that almost kind of like, I don't know, it made me cringe a little bit. Like, no, we can't accept yet. We can still like change. We can still like get on a better path, So I guess when thinking about like living the good life, it kind of brought me back to like the definition of sustainability. Like I guess for me, living the good life was like is trying to make like almost the future a better place for other people.
Yeah.
Like that's how I would feel like fulfilled in my life.
Yeah. And, I've never, one of the critiques of that term sustainability that I've always liked is, I forget who was saying it, but they said, it's like if someone said, would you like your marriage to be sustainable? It's like, well, I can think of a lot of things I'd like it to be, but I'd like it to be more than just sustainable. I'd like it to be rich and loving and fulfilling and joyful and all these things. And that sustainability doesn't capture all those things, right? And I think I hear in your desire to bring other people along and to have a richer world for them, that same idea, right? That like we want our marriages or our relationships or whatever whatever connections you choose to have with people who are really close to you to be really fulfilling and rich and full. And that's more than this term sustainability, I think, can bear. And I hear you, right? That I don't want to take a palliative approach to my marriage either, right? Like, well, it is what it is. I'll just have it limp along and hopefully everybody will be without pain, right? Like, that's not good enough. We need to, like, let's make this great. So yes, I think that, and I threw that out there in part because it is so provocative, right? To say like, I'm all for palliative care. Don't get me wrong. I mean, when you are nearing end of life, that's a really important thing. And the people who work in hospice all around the country and world are just, they're wonderful, wonderful individuals. But I don't think we're there yet globally. Like, I don't think we are quite at that place. Like, we can still find cures for these things. And just, retreating to our gardens and growing our radishes is probably like not enough, as much as I want to acknowledge that for some people that is all they can do, right? But at the same time, many of us can do much more than that, particularly working together, particularly by partnering with other individuals and then with groups partnering with one another. And so, in our course, for instance, we've looked at the Line 3 controversy up north, and to see the ways in which that has brought so many different groups together. And there's, lots of good discussion and debate about the validity of it and the path and the disagreement among some of the tribes and so on, right? There's lots of controversies, and that's what our class is for. I won't get into it now. But what is inspiring, I think, is the ways that this isn't just a native issue, right? This is not just, or this isn't just an energy issue. Since you're all in the energy club, you probably know all about this, right? This is a huge societal issue, and this is an issue of futurity. And can we imagine a different future? The future we've imagined for a long time has been a future full of pipelines. And maybe we need a different imagination. Maybe we need to think really differently about this as a culture, as well as individuals. And so that's another vote, I think, for the approach that Kimmerer offers us, is an approach that is not just about sort of pie in the sky futurity, but the power of the imagination. And to say, like, not just, oh, well, we have a demand for this oil, and therefore we need to fulfill it in this way. We can think differently, as many people, of course, have started to do, and talked about alternative transportation and the electrification of everything, and all of the major auto manufacturers now are like, we're going electric. We're going to have electric fleets of everything, and this is what we have to do. And so I don't see that reflected as much as it should be in discourse about pipeline. So that's just one example, I think. I don't know how long do you usually go, VJ? I think we've talked about an hour.
Usually would end right about now. I'm happy to stick around. But for anyone who needs to get going, I'll just do our final announcements real quick. Dan, if you need to also, I don't know what your situation is, but
I can stay for a little bit. That's
okay.
Totally fine. But I just didn't want to keep people if they were like, is he ever going to stop talking? So
go ahead and give my final announcements, and then we can stick around for a bit if anyone wants to. Okay. So here's all of our social media handles. Since this is our last meeting, feel free to stay in touch with us there. Hopefully you all know our email address. And for next year, if you have any, new students who are coming to the university, transfer students, first year students who you think would be interested in our mission, feel free to send them our link to our newsletter so that they can sign up and find out about all of our upcoming events at the beginning of the fall semester. And, in this way that, here we are at the end of the school year, but it's not the end. We're going to continue this work. Energy Club will meet again in the fall. And so I just want to say, Dokshta, we'll see you again for sure. And if you haven't already signed in, feel free to go ahead and do that. But I want to thank you all for joining us this year for some really awesome, thought-provoking, and often difficult, but very transformative discussions. So I hope that this has been good for you, that you've learned some good things from this, and that you come away from this year with, new knowledge, but also with some inspiration to keep this work going. So thank you, everybody, miigwech, and I hope that you all stay safe and get vaccinated.